Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining in. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. The project was backed by Project Catalyst, Fund 13. All of this is community funded, free to use, and all of the commentary and the legal thinking behind the templates are open to everybody to be used. What we often see here is the parties agreeing on a fixed scope. So essentially saying that there's a fixed build that will be delivered at a fixed price, but they're not providing enough specifics on the features of the build and the expected, it's essentially the expected characteristics. And then what we have is the developer sort of expecting a very reasonable, practical build. Like imagine just a practical family car, like a Honda or Toyota that just gets you to where you want to be, but it is no luxury by any means. And this is described by a car with 4 wheels and a steering wheel, right? But then you have the client who also imagines a car with a steering wheel and 4 wheels, but then they're imagining a luxury Porsche, for instance. And then for the SLA, this is a bit trickier, but usually what we see is the uptime negotiation, and that is relatively straightforward, essentially discussing whether the software should have an uptime of 99.99% or 98% is fine. It's difficult to provide more general guidance there because it really depends on what you're building. So this is something that's not contemplated by many NDAs, and if you're signing a standard NDA, there's a chance that you might be in breach from day one, because it is impossible to remove the other party's information that you stored on the ledger. Here we're using an obfuscation clause, which essentially says if you're storing something on chain in an encrypted manner, you have to destroy any keys. You have to ensure that this can't be decrypted, even if the on-chain information can't be erased later on. So this is one of the sort of main features of the Cardano specific NDA. You're usually working remotely, globally, often with pseudonymous or anonymous teams. It might be very difficult to chase your payments, and therefore we are tying the transfer of intellectual property to the payment. And therefore, essentially, we're building a handbrake for you, where if the customer isn't paying, you can prevent them from using the intellectual property that you developed or provided for them, which is very, very useful for when you want to enforce your claim. Just really make sure that both the recipient and you understand and have very clear rules on what they can do with the tokens when they receive them. Whether they can sell them immediately, or there's some sort of a vesting, or there's a vesting but then there's a lockup, or whether whether you're like pre-token generation event, and therefore the lockup will only apply after the TGE. So there's a lot of sort of minutiae and details on how the tokens are owned and when they can be transferred, and this is the number one term that you should have covered if you're giving out sort of motivational tokens to the team.